Conversation about the plagues. All right, I'd like to hear it. So we have a very important conversation to have together this morning. And that's really, now that we've been through the two Seders, everyone kind of does it their own way. Should women really be reclining at the Seder? I mean, after all, we know that it's a custom to recline. In fact, it's actually a mitzvah to recline at the Seder. But why do Jews recline at the Seder? Because, right, not because Pharaoh reclined, but because slaves don't recline, because the Greeks, when we patterned the Seder off of the Greek banquet, the Greek leaders, the Greek free men, they recline. They recline, by the way, to their left. As we know, because if you recline to your right, you're more inclined to choke. So we recline to our left, and we drink our wine and we eat our food with our right hand, because left hand means something else. So if we are lefty, then you have a hard time getting it in your mouth. I think is what ultimately that means. But we lean to the left because it is the way of free people, according to the Talmud, to recline while they eat. So it is that we turn to the mitzvah on the first page of your handout now. This comes from the Mishnah found in the Babylonian Talmud, Masechet Pesachim, which is the plural of Passover, right? Pesach, Pesachim. On the eve of Passover, close to Mincha, a person may not eat until it becomes dark, and even the poorest man in Israel may not eat until he reclines. And they must not give him less than 4 cups of wine, even if he is supported from the charity platter. This mitzvah of reclining is incumbent upon all men. So said Margie, what else is new? Right? And why? I'm setting you up here. We're good. All right. There'll be a whole different show at noon. You'll see this. So we now transition to a little later in the Talmud where it says, a woman in the presence of her husband is not required to recline during the Seder on the night of Passover. Why is she not required to recline? Say again? He's doing it, okay, so on one hand, he's doing it for her. He's, as the head of the family, if you will, he is reclining for her. And as the comedian says, and I get lots of miles out of this joke, the man is absolutely the head of the family, and the wife is the neck, and she can turn the head any which way she wants to. Okay, so maybe he's doing it for her. Why is a woman not obligated to recline? Exactly right. Because thousands of years ago, right? This is the Talmud actually written 1,500 years ago. Right? Women were, let's say, inferior. That's a nice word. Subordinate, subservient to their husbands, and reclining at the Seder is a sign of freedom. Reclining at the Seder is a sign of freedom. So according to the Talmud, a woman in the presence of her husband is not required to recline. However, if she is an Isha Hashuvah, the Talmud tells us, she is required to recline. If she's an Isha Hashuvah, an important woman, she is required to recline. And then it goes on to say, a son in the presence of his father is required to recline. That's where we're going. Thank you for asking the question. That's exactly where we're going. But what's interesting, a son in the presence of his father is still required to recline. Why is that interesting? Because one would think, if the father is the head of the family, however old the father and son might be, out of deference, out of respect, out of subordination to the father, one might think that the son, no matter how old he is not required to recline. So the Talmud clarifies that a son in the presence of his father is required to recline. It's interesting. And it comes all the more so to show perhaps the secondary status that wives had in ancient times. The no status that wives had in ancient times.
Could it also be related to women not being required to wear that one dress?
Okay, so could it be related to women not being required to wear a talis and tefillin? There's a very specific category of obligation upon men and upon women. Right? So women are not obligated to any mitzvah that is a time-bound positive commandment. So when you wear your tzitzit during the day, that is a time-bound positive commandment. You shall wear them during the day. You shall pray 3 times a day. Those are time-bound positive commandments that, according to the Talmud, right, women are not obligated to. The idea being, frankly, that they were busy raising children and couldn't conform to the time requirements of the mitzvahs. And so, by and large, they're not obligated to time-bound positive commandments. There are exceptions. Eating matzah, for example, is an obligation incumbent upon women and men. Lighting Shabbos candles is a time-bound positive mitzvah on women. Making challah is the same thing. So here we have this setup that a woman, a wife in the presence of her husband, is not required to recline unless she is an isha chashuvah. So of course that begs the question that Joanne asked, okay, what is an isha chashuvah? What is an important person? An important woman, pardon me. The Rashbam, Rabbi Shmuel ben Meir in 11th century France, he wrote, a woman is not required to recline. What does this mean? On account of fear or awe, yirah is the Hebrew word, reverence for her husband and her subordination to him. All right, so that's the answer we've been giving all along. That's why a woman is not obligated to recline in the presence of her husband. But he gives another reason. And in the Shelot of Rav Achai Gaon, 8th century Babylonia, it's explained that it's just not the way of women to recline. Women don't like to recline when they eat. Right? And so, because we know that women don't like to recline when they eat, they don't have to. 2 different explanations for why a woman is not required to recline. One is she's still subordinate to her husband and thus not a free person, so she's not obligated to. The other one, simply we know, as Rav Achai must know women. He says women, they don't like to recline at the Seder, so they don't have to. The Tosafot, however, slightly later, the Tosafot are descendants of the school of Rashi. By and large, Rashi had daughters primarily, and so the Tosafot are the rabbis who married Rashi's granddaughters, and they became the grandchildren of Rashi. So the Tosafot were commenting on the Isha Chashuvah. If she's an important woman, she's required to recline. They're pragmatists. The Tosafot said all our women are important women, and thus they're required to recline. So the Tosafos were the modern, 21st century thinkers of their day. All our women are important women, they're required to recline. Rabbi Joseph Caro, as he began to encode Jewish law in the 16th century with the Shulchan Aruch and other texts, he, of course, speaking for the Sephardic community, he looks to Rabbi Manoach in the 13th century. And Rabbi Caro writes that Rabbi Manoach writes that the meaning of Isha Chashuvah, important woman, is that she has no husband and is the head of a household. Right? So that's the Isha Chashuvah. She has no husband and is thus the head of her household. Alternatively, she is important by virtue of the fruits of her hands, the daughter of the leaders of her generation, a woman of valor and God-fearing. Or, she is important in that she has men servants and maid servants, so that she does not have to busy herself with cooking and housework. All of these are different requirements for the definition of Isha Chashuvah, an important woman who is then obligated to recline at the Seder. So Larry President Niemeyer asked a very important question. Is there a difference between not required and cannot? The answer in a good rabbinic way is, well, on one hand, the Talmud says very clearly that a woman in the presence of her husband is not required to recline. which seems to give the option that if she so wants, she can, but she doesn't have to. The way Judaism and the Jewish community, Jewish law has worked over time is that in various other circumstances, whenever someone is not required to do something, they become obligated not to do it. So it starts as this idea of not requiring, and then it goes and evolves into this idea that it actually becomes a prohibition.
What I thought was that if she was reclining, that maybe the consensus was that she was available, and that's why if she was married, she wasn't reclining.
So it's almost a sexual innuendo if she was to recline. My head did not go there, but okay, that's an interesting. So the saying Kaddish is a fabulous question. So it began that men were obligated to say Kaddish, women were not obligated to. And so in answer to your question, there are thus communities who say because women are not obligated to, they can't. So there are some communities that say that they can't. We say men and women are equal, so women are just as obligated to say Kaddish as men are. Yeah, it actually does go to the question of holiness. And this is sort of a modern Orthodox take on it, not an ancient Orthodox, but at least a modern Orthodox take on it, is that women are actually holier. And because women are holier, they're not subject to all the mitzvot, all the commandments that we men need to overcome our animal nature. And we men have to transcend our animal nature, and we need the rules in order to become holy. Whereas women, by their very nature, are more spiritual, are holier, and thus they don't need all of these mitzvot. That's a beautiful modern midrash. We know from more ancient texts, it doesn't seem to, the texts don't seem to indicate it as such.
When I first started reading Talmud, it was after the first development class in spring of 1984. Beyond all the jaws that dropped, people ask me about it. My explanation is that for a woman to wear a Talmud, in my view, is neither prescribed nor proscribed. And then there's this middle ground where I have a choice to take on this obligation.
So in the very specific language similar here to the Talmud, where it says the woman is not required to, that was your interpretation of the mitzvah of tzitzi, is that a woman is not required to, but also that she's not prevented from.
That is my interpretation.
But who made this stipulation that you can't?
Who made it?
Was this made then?
Man is the answer to the question. Right? It's really an evolution of the text. When someone is not required to do something, over time, eventually people start to say, well, if you're not required to, it must mean that you can't.
That's not what the word required.
But it's not correct. It's just how the tradition evolved. And I'm not justifying it, just explaining it for the record. All right, so if we turn to the second page, the back side of your worksheet, we come to a modern approach. And this is Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, who was the great posek, the great Jewish legal decider for the Jewish community, the Orthodox Jewish community in America. And he looks to a couple different sources to come justify his opinion. First, he looks to the Bach, who was Rabbi Joel Sirkis, 17th century Poland. And Rabbi Feinstein says that the Bach raised a question concerning the Rashbam's opinion, we read the Rashbam's opinion, that the reason that a woman does not recline is fear of her husband. For the Bach says, an important woman must also fear her husband. So in Isha Chashuva, even a woman who has servants, male servants, female servants, who under the definition of Isha Chashuva is supposed to recline, according to traditional text, she should also be subservient to her husband, right? Or she should be reverent toward him. So he says there seems to be a problem with these definitions of Isha Chashuva and our understanding of who's obligated to recline. So he says his question, the Bach's question, is incomprehensible. Is it a mitzvah and the wish of the sages that a woman should fear her husband in everyday matters that do not concern him, particularly when disregarding a mitzvah is at stake? Meaning whether you're supposed to recline or not is a significant mitzvah. And if there's any ambiguity as to whether a woman is an Ishat HaShuvah, an important woman, where should you defer? Should you defer to not reclining, or should you defer to reclining? So Rabbi Feinstein goes on to say, furthermore, it is not a good thing for a husband to be exacting toward his wife. And we see that for the last several hundred years, husbands do not insist on this lack of reclining. As we see in the Beit Yosef, in the name of the Ri, and the name of the Tosafot, where it is stated that all of our women are important and are required to recline. And the Mordechai cites this as well. So what he comes to say is that the history, the evolution of the text, at first goes toward the idea that women shouldn't recline at all because they're more subservient to men. And then over time, it actually evolves as we come into modern Europe, that women actually began to recline. And the husbands didn't say anything about it, they let it happen, so to speak. They didn't say anything. So it had actually, the custom had actually evolved that now women were reclining. Marjorie, you say something?
Yeah, they wanted to get dinner.
They wanted to get right. They don't bite the hand that feeds you. It is not possible, Rabbi Feinstein says, to explain that all women have literally become important. Now, mind you, in the technical definition of Ishat HaShuvah, which would require that their husbands respect them even as they would respect important people in everyday life. Let's not go too far. Rather, we must conclude that over the course of time, they, that is everyone in society, recognize that men have no reason to feel superior to their wives. And women recognize the great need that their husbands have for them, which is the same as their need for their husbands, and who knew that their husbands were aware of this as well. In other words, in our own day and age, this is even the Orthodox Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. He says, wives need their husbands, husbands need their wives. And thus, women are required to recline at the Seder table. So, of course, we recline to our left, and we all celebrate it as free men and women, and how grateful we all are to be in America, where we can truly celebrate our freedom. Just wanted to take an interesting look at the evolution of the role of women in traditional texts with regard to Pesach. Certainly within the conservative movement, where we hold men and women equal, it's somewhat of a moot conversation. All of our, just like the Tosafot would say, in conservative Judaism, all our women are important women, and thus all are required to recline and participate fully in the life of the synagogue. With that, we'll say, Chag Sameach.